Now, we've spent a lot of time importing data from other sources. Let's talk about how we can create a raster using R. So we're going to create a raster in this next section. Let's create a title. We're going to close this section and clear our console. So we know all the different elements of a raster. We know that it needs an extent, a resolution, it needs data, it needs a grid on which values can go into. So we need all of these components in order to create a raster. The first thing we can do is create a raster from scratch using the raster function. So the same thing that we used before, this one here, but instead of importing a TIFF file, we're going to create a raster from scratch. I'm going to call it R. Actually, I'm going to call it test raster. And we use the raster function. But instead of providing a file name, we provide a number of rows and a number of columns. And to provide the number of rows, we use nrow. I'm just going to do 3 for now. And then we need column data, number of columns. Again, I'm going to do 3. So let's run that and take a look. So there you go. We already have a raster layer that we created. We have 3 rows, 3 columns, and that equals 9 cells. We have a resolution, and then it provides a default WGS84 coordinate reference system. And it provides a default extent as well. So let's try plotting this as well, because I want to show you what happens. Oops. So we tried plotting it and we immediately got an error, and it tells you exactly why. There's no values in it, so there's nothing to plot. So now that we have this basic raster layer, we need to input some values. We can assign values by using the values function. Everything is very intuitive in R. So we know that our raster is called test raster. So inside the values function, we need to input the raster in which we want to provide values. So we want to put values into test raster. And then we need to give it like a vector of numbers. So we know that we have 9 cells, so we need at least 9 values that can go into this raster. And I'm just going to use a very simple function here called nCell. So let me show you what nCell is. nCell tells you the number of cells in a raster. So let's put our test raster in there. And we can see that we have 9 rasters. So I want to create a number vector from 1 to 9 and then use that as our values in R. So if we want to create a numeric vector, we can do 1 to n cell test raster, and that'll easily create a vector of 9 numbers, which is exactly the number we need for this raster. Let's use this as our vector of values. So let's go over this again. We need values in our raster to plot it or to work with it at all. To assign values, we use the values function, and in order to assign values to our test raster, we need to provide a vector of numbers. And we created a vector of numbers by using 1 to the n cell of our test raster. Let's take a look at, let's run this actually, and let's take another look at our test raster. Okay, so now we have values. You have numbers from 1 to n, 1 to 9, which makes sense because that's what we provided it. Let's try plotting this again. Now we have a raster. So we have a legend that goes from 1 to 9, and the values slowly increase because that's what we assigned it. We have cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, and it's being assigned numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. if you have another vector of numeric data that you want to plot, it would have to match this format where it goes from left to right, north to south. Okay, so we have this raster, but what if we wanted to increase the resolution? Because we have a default resolution here, but what if we wanted to change the resolution? What we can do is create another raster and then resample it. So let's create another raster called S, and I want it to have 10 rows and 10 columns. Let's run that. And keep in mind, when I say increase the resolution, I mean I want more than 9 cells. So in order to change our initial raster, we need to resample it. So that will essentially, it'll increase the number of cells from 3 by 3 to 10 by 10. So there's going to be 100 cells instead of 9. But the critical question is, how do we know how to assign the values? Like, are they all consistent between cells? Do we have to find the average, a moving average? What I want to do is a bilinear interpolation. So I want to interpolate between values to resample our raster. So what we're going to do is create another raster. I'm going to call it M. And we're going to use a function called resample. And in this function, we have to provide 3 different arguments. We need to provide the first raster that we created, so our test raster. This is the more coarse one. It has fewer rows and fewer columns. Then we need to provide the second raster, which is this one. So that's the high resolution raster that we want to create. And we need to provide a way for R to sample the data. And we're going to use bilinear interpolation. So let's do that now. And to provide the interpolation method, we have to use an argument called method. And then we type out the type of interpolation we want. So we want bilinear. Let's run that and plot it. So there you go. You can see that the number of cells has obviously increased. We have 100 now. And it used bilinear interpolation in order to find an average of the values from 1 to 9, which we specified here. Basically what happened is it used bilinear interpolation to fill in the missing values, to average out values and create this high resolution raster. And let's compare that with the original. We can actually compare both side by side using a very helpful function called par. So what this function does is it allows you to plot 2 plots right next to each other. So we have 2 plots, we want them to be in the same row, and we run that, and then we can plot both next to each other. Oops. There's our first raster, and there's our second raster. So you can see the differences between the two. So congratulations on creating your first raster. I have some homework in the module for you to complete, and that'll give you some good practice for creating, modifying, and working with raster data.